Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our brand new unit on sensation and perception. So, we've spent the last number of class periods looking at different structures in the brain and thinking about the way that they function in terms of creating the thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that we experience as human beings, which is really that essence of psychology. This unit, sensation and perception, is going to move us into the interplay area between what's going on in our brain and what's going on in the world around us. And so we're really going to be spending some time in that environment versus biology area together when we look at sensation and perception. So this unit that we have coming up is going to contain a little tiny bit of science, but far more real world application probably than you felt like you've experienced so far in the curriculum. So really excited to dive into it with you. I think sensation and perception are fascinating. And so, just to give you an idea of some of the things that we're going to be thinking about together during this unit, want you to try to imagine what your world would be like if you could no longer see in color, but only in black, white, and gray. Or what if you could only hear extremely high pitched intonations and nothing else registered in your brain? Or what if you could only taste bitter and salty food, but not sweet? That would be the saddest for me, I think. Or what if you totally lost your sense of touch? I think that our sensory system and the ability of our senses to translate information from the world around us into neural impulses so that our brain can understand it, we totally take that for granted every single day. And we only realize that that's at play when something starts to go wrong. So, as we study sensation and perception together as part of this unit, you're going to learn that our understanding of the world around us really depends on this elaborate sensory system that processes incoming information. This is trippy to think about. Think about this. So, none of us actually experience the world directly because our brain is responsible for helping us experience the world, but it's stuck inside our skull. It doesn't have any access to the actual world around it except through this series of filters, which is our sensory system working together, right? And so we're going to begin our study by looking at the difference between sensation and perception. And then we're going to move for this portion of material into some different theories that seek to better understand why and how we perceive particular sensory input in the way that we do. And again, I think that this stuff is going to be really interesting for you. It's so crazy to think about the fact that our minds do not have any direct connection with the outside world. And so, accordingly, then, the information that our brains receive about events going on in the environment, they're always going to be slightly skewed based on what's coming in and different factors affecting our senses. So let's dive right into the fun here and let's talk about the difference between sensation and perception. Here's the part where you're going to start completing your interactive notebook for this particular material. So this is interactive notebook section 1 and 2 related to sensation and perception. And here you're just going to get down the definition of these important terms. Okay. So sensation includes anything about how we receive or detect stimuli that are happening in the world around us. It refers to any information coming from the senses at the brain. That could be visual input, auditory input, taste, smell, touch, temperature, pain, balance, coordination, movement, anything from our bodily systems that are sending information to the brain. Okay. Perception then happens in the brain, and perception occurs when our brain now is interpreting the information that it's received from our different sensory systems. This all happens through a process called transduction, right? Our brain cannot directly detect sound waves, for instance. And so there's mechanisms in our ear that transduce or change sound waves into neural impulses, which is the language of the brain, so that the brain can understand. So kind of like an interpreter system going on in the body when sensory information is transduced into neural impulses that are then able to be perceived by the brain. Okay, why do we care about this in psychology? Specifically, experimental psychologists investigate different ways that sensation and perception interact for each of the senses, as well as a variety of unusual sensory phenomena to provide the basis, for both basic and applied research. And specifically, this helps us develop a better understanding of how humans interact with the world in general, potentially allowing for improvements in the treatment of sensory disorders and other things of that nature. But for our daily purposes, I also just think it's fascinating to understand how our brain is working to interpret all of the different things that the world throws at it on any given day. Okay, so we're going to talk for a little bit about a couple of foundational terms when it comes to sensation and perception. And so for this portion of your interactive notebook, go ahead and just get down the basic definitions of these principles in your own words, and then feel free to add any relevant examples that you see fit. You're welcome to add the picture examples from this presentation into your interactive notebook, draw your own picture or copy and paste your own picture, write something with words, whatever is going to help you best make personal meaning about these particular terms. And then we'll unpack these a little bit more together in class next time during our review. Okay. One way that we think about how people perceive sensory information that's coming at the brain is via a set of Gestalt principles. And Gestalt psychologists emphasized our tendency as people to try to integrate individual pieces of information into meaningful wholes. Okay, so for instance, if you look at the picture underneath Gestalt principles there, if you look at item C, to me, that looks like a spike ball. I'm not sure what it looks like to you, but basically, because that looks like a spike ball to me, that's an example of my brain trying to take the individual cylindrical shapes there and kind of the absence of space in that white space. And instead of me interpreting it as that, those individual features, instead my brain perceives a spike ball. And so Gestalt psychologists are interested in looking at how our brain makes perceptual meaning, perceptual wholes out of individual pieces of information. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail moving forward. Another area that psychologists look at is depth perception. And this is something we definitely all take for granted unless something's going on with our depth perception system. But depth perception obviously is the ability to see objects in 3 dimensions, even though the image that strikes the retina from the environment is 2 dimensional. But our eyes adapt for that, and that allows us to judge for distance. So super important that we have that ability. This ability develops around 6 to 9 months old, and I'm going to tell you next time in class about a fascinating experiment that helps psychologists figure that out. A couple other terms for us to look at, bottom-up processing versus top-down processing. So we've talked about how sensory information comes at the brain via our nervous system. And then how do we make meaning out of that? There's 2 processes that are happening simultaneously in our brain, and we want to be able to distinguish between these 2 different types of processing. So as sensory information makes it into the brain, at the same time, our brain is engaging in bottom-up processing, and that's where the brain is taking sensory information at the individual features level and trying to build that into a perceptual whole. So if we're looking at that Dalmatian, our brain might be telling us, I see black, I see white, I see black dots, I see a white shape. Oh, it looks like it's the shape of a dog. Oh, it's a dog. That's bottom-up processing. At the same time, top-down processing is occurring. And that's where, based on our own models, ideas, expectations, our mental set, things that have happened to us via previous life experiences, our brain wants to automatically create shortcuts for us, and it will immediately just identify something that's coming in at it. And so top-down processing would be like, it's a dog, it's a Dalmatian, right away. And connecting that to other things that we've already seen or heard or experienced in our life. And so the idea is that top-down processing, it happens really quickly and automatically. It's heavily influenced by previous experiences that we've had. And because of that, it's not always correct. It's very prone to error. And so we always want to take a minute once we think that we see something or we're interpreting something in a certain way and do a little check. Give our bottom-up processing system time to actually put the real pieces together. Okay. So for example, I just flashed this image on the screen, and by now you've probably all perceived that this is Ed Sheeran. But at the same time, Bottom-up processing was helping you put all of those features together, and top-down processing, some of you realize it's Ed Sheeran way more quickly than others. Some of you might not have any idea who Ed Sheeran is, and so your brain identified this as just a random red-haired guy, so on and so forth. So that's kind of an example of how top-down processing can really differ and be prone to error based on our previous experiences. Couple of other foundational concepts when we think about sensation and perception. So I'm sure you guys have all experienced selective attention in your lives and the limits of selective attention in your lives. But the idea is that at any given time, tons and tons of sensory information are competing for your brain's attention. And as a human being, it's really only possible to selectively pay attention to one thing at a time. We are terrible multitaskers as human beings, but we all think that we're amazing multitaskers. We'll do some activities next time in class to show you that you are not, my friend, a great multitasker, because no human is a great multitasker because of the way that our brains function. But the idea behind selective attention is that um, in in us as adaptive human beings, we have the ability among all the things competing for our attention, typically to decide what is the most important thing for me to pay attention to right now and to sustain attention on that particular thing. Okay. Usually, selective attention then can work to our advantage, but sometimes it works to our disadvantage, especially when we choose the wrong thing to selectively attend to. So in the example here, if you're riding in the car with your friends, you should be selectively attending to the road and you're driving, but it's really easy to get distracted by an interesting conversation that your friends are having in the car. And so if you choose to selectively attend to that, or even if subconsciously you start selectively attending to that and then you miss what's going on in the road, that can have terrible consequences for you. If any of you, probably never in this course, just kidding, guys, but if any of you have ever been in a course where you are trying so hard to selectively attend to the lecture that's going on in class, but oh my goodness, you really just want to selectively attend to something else on your laptop or on your computer or something that your friend's doing, you've noticed that battle for yourself in terms of what am I going to selectively attend to? So that's the idea behind selective attention, is that when we are faced with competing stimuli, typically we're able to determine this is the thing that's most important for me to pay attention to right now. Okay. Couple of other things that help us think about what do we actually perceive among competing stimuli and what do we not. So we talked about selective attention. But in order to selectively attend to something in the first place, your brain actually has to detect that it exists in the world around you. And so here, we're going to talk about two different theories that seek to explain at what point do we actually notice in our brain that something is going on in the world around us? Because again, our brain doesn't have direct contact with the outside world. It's relying on our sensory system to give it information. So we're first going to talk about threshold theory, and then we're going to talk about signal detection theory. So threshold theory basically says there is a minimum level of stimulus intensity that needs to be present in order for our brains to register the fact that that stimulus is in fact in our environment. Anything below that, we are not going to actually pay attention to or perceive. And so it might be affecting us, but at a subliminal level. So for example, when my husband and I, when we had our first child, oh my word, you guys, I was so sleep deprived because we would go to bed at night and then my child, obviously, because he's a baby, would just wake up screaming his head off, right? And so the second that I heard my baby screaming, I would immediately pop absolutely awake because my absolute threshold for that stimulus was satisfied, right? So I heard the baby crying. I immediately register, oh, my baby's crying. And then I get up and take care of the baby. My dear husband, however, his absolute threshold for that sound was far higher than mine because he would just keep snoring away and sleeping soundly throughout the night. Even though the cries of my baby, that sound stimulus woke me up immediately, it wasn't enough to wake him up. Okay, so something about an absolute threshold is that there's individual differences in terms of our absolute thresholds. But for all people, the absolute threshold of stimulus intensity is when the stimulus is present enough that you can detect its presence about 50% of the time. Okay, um, we say that an absolute threshold is lower than someone else's when it takes less of that stimulus to actually register that for our brain. So in the applied example that I just gave you, my absolute threshold for my children's crying to this day is far lower than my husband's, meaning it takes far less distress signaling from my kids for me to come running to them than it does for my husband. He just doesn't hear it. It doesn't register to him in the same way that it does for me. There's probably other examples that you might want to write down for your own that are going to help you think about that for yourselves. I guess another example that I can think of related to school would be all of your teachers probably have different absolute thresholds for the amount of sound that they hear. So in one teacher's class, you might be able to get away with talking kind of loudly to the person next to you. And if your teacher has a really high absolute threshold, meaning that it takes a lot of sound stimuli for that to be reached, then you might be talking and talking and talking, and your teacher never even realizes that you're talking. And so you don't get in trouble for that. But you might have another teacher who, dang, if you even turn to your friend and whisper something to that friend, that teacher's eyes are on you. They had a lower absolute threshold for your talking stimulus. So there's another example. Tons of examples of how this can affect us in the world around us. So that's an absolute threshold. The minimum amount of stimulus needed to be present for me to detect that the stimulus is in fact there. Okay, a difference threshold is the minimum difference that occurs in the amount of a stimulus in order for me to be able to detect that a change occurred. So for example, we'll do another sound example since those have been the ones I've been giving you so far. I always go to bed at night earlier than my husband. I'm super tired. I want to go to sleep. And he stays up late on the couch and watches TV super loudly. And it bugs me because I need it to be really quiet when I go to sleep. And so every single night of my life on this earth, I tell my husband, the sound's too loud, turn it down. I yell it kind of not that nicely from our room. And so then if he is lowering the volume on the remote control, the difference threshold for me is crossed when I actually notice with my own ear that a change in the level of sound has occurred. Okay. Um, Sometimes this is also referred to as the just noticeable difference. So when my husband's listening to the sound loudly on the couch and I'm like, hey, turn it down, the first couple clicks of the remote, I might not register. It might still sound the same to me. But eventually, the difference in the levels of sound is going to be big enough that my brain registers it as a difference. And then I'm like, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. So that would be another example. Or maybe when you go to bed, I have a bad habit. I will tell you what, I always look at my phone right when I go to bed at night. I know you're not supposed to do it, but I do it anyway. And a lot of times I'm surprised at the level of brightness on my screen. So when I'm looking at my cell phone at night, it's too bright for me and I want to make it less bright. The just noticeable difference for me then, or the difference threshold is met when as I'm diminishing my brightness in the settings, my brain actually perceives, oh, it's much more dim now. This feels better for my eyes. Okay, so the difference threshold is the amount of difference that needs to happen until we realize that a difference did occur. Weber's law refers to, and you don't need to know this in detail, but you do need to know Weber's law, generally speaking, refers to this principle that for two stimuli to be perceived as different, they have to differ by a constant minimum percentage and not a constant amount. Okay, so to illustrate that for you, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and watch this very brief video that I've embedded here related to the difference threshold of sound emanating from your car when you're driving around town. And that's going to explain that for you. Let's go ahead and pause the video and do that now.
Well, here I am in my car, and I'm going to.
All right. Moving forward then, so we just talked about threshold theory. We talked about absolute threshold and we talked about difference threshold. And threshold theory in general can provide us with some helpful information, but kind of an assumption related to that theory is that it just tells us what we're going to pay attention to when there's no other competing stimuli happening in our lives, which is kind of never. And so it's a little bit useful, but signal detection theory takes um, our ideas about sensation and perception a step further by actually predicting how and when we are going to detect the presence of a stimulus, like how and when our absolute and difference thresholds are going to be met amid everything else that's actually going on in our lives. And so signal detection theory would actually probably put forth the idea that, well, technically, there isn't an absolute threshold that's the same in all circumstances for an individual, because what a person pays attention to or perceives also depends on the other types of things that are going on in their environment, their experiences, their expectation, their motivation, their alertness. So, for instance, if we go back to the example of my child crying at night, I gave you that example for an absolute threshold. Signal detection theory would say, well, if you are a mom who thinks that their child is going to wake up crying every night, if that's your expectation, if you're super motivated to respond to your child's needs as a mom, and if you're relatively alert throughout the night while you're sleeping, like you're not sleeping soundly, then you're going to be far more likely to hear your child crying and to have a lower absolute threshold than a mom who is literally just dead tired, does not want to hear their child crying, is exhausted, sleeps really deeply at night, then you're going to have a different absolute threshold for that amount of stimulus if you're in that state. Okay, so signal detection theory tries to take those additional factors into account. Okay. Sensory adaptation is one more term that we want to look at related to these foundational principles of sensation and perception. And the idea behind sensory adaptation is that to detect new things in our surroundings, which is adaptive for us as human beings, our senses are programmed to eventually tune out a constant stimulus. So, the idea behind sensory adaptation is that even though there's a constant amount of stimulus in our environment in some way, sending the exact same message to the brain over time, eventually our brain is going to tune that out and stop focusing on it whatsoever. So the perception feels like it becomes smaller or goes away altogether, even though the stimulus is still there. So maybe you've had the experience of getting a rock in your shoe. And at first, you notice the rock so intensely. Let's say it's a tiny little rock, but you don't have time to clean out your shoe at that particular moment. So you just keep moving about your day. Eventually, your brain is going to stop telling you to pay attention to that rock. It's like, whatever, it's been there for a while. I'm going to focus on new things. Or if you've ever gotten into the shower and you like to take really hot showers, as you're taking a shower and the temperature of the water remains constant, your brain stops paying as much attention to that because it doesn't need to. It's not a new stimulus that your brain is trying to figure out. And so even though the temperature of the water stays the same, your brain perceives it as getting slightly cooler. And so now you've adapted to that temperature, you need to turn the temperature up a little bit more. That's kind of the idea behind sensory adaptation. All right, so we talked about those foundational principles of sensation and perception. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the Gestalt principles of perception in particular. So the Gestalt movement or school was founded in Germany in 1912, and Gestaltists tried to explain perceptions in terms of organized wholes rather than by analyzing individual parts. Okay. When trying to make sense of the world around us, Gestalt psychology suggests that we don't simply focus on every small component that comes at our brain. Rather, our brains try to create these mental shortcuts for us by perceiving objects in our environment as part of a greater whole. And a lot of times, this is also based on that top down processing based on our previous experiences. So, what we're going to do right now is we're going to look at a set of Gestalt principles that are always at play that seek to help us understand some of the ways in which our brain groups things together in our environment. And again, these are not always perfect because we're relying on top-down processing a lot, which is prone to error. Okay. But for these different principles in your interactive notebook, go ahead and put down the definition and an example. For my brain, it's actually helpful to see visual examples of these Gestalt principles. So you're welcome to copy and paste these images into your interactive notebook. I'm also, though, going to give you real life examples if those real life connections are a little bit more helpful for you in terms of helping these concepts stick in your brain. Okay. So the first Gestalt principle we're going to look at is similarity. This basically says that similar things tend to appear as grouped together. And this applies to both visual and auditory stimuli. So, for instance, when you're looking at the dots here, you could say that there are two groups. There are white dots and there are blue groups or blue dots. And we perceive these two groups as such because they have the same shape and they're the same color as each other. We see blue dots, we see white dots, and that's what most people would say they see. Look at that particular picture. In real life, let's use the example of a performance at halftime at the football game. I know lots of you love to go to the school football games. Similarity could be the band members in their band uniforms create a sense of similarity. So it's really easy for you to tell they're in the band. They look the same, right? That's the idea. Okay, the Gestalt principle is connectedness. So connectedness happens when our brain perceives connections in objects that are actually disjointed. One example is when you can see the image kind of connect the dots before you connect the dots, right? Or when people find constellations in the sky, they actually just see individual dots, but their brain is connecting those dots together. In the image that you see in front of you, those are actually a bunch of individual randomly shaped objects, but your mind might see that almost as like a tortoise shell or some sort of landscape or something like that because your brain's trying to connect those individual pieces to actually make some sense out of them. Okay, an example going back to our halftime show, if we're thinking about a marching band and connectedness, a lot of times marching band members will split themselves off into different subgroups so that they can form a letter. And our brain might see the letter A or CLHS if the band is doing something of that nature. Individual people connected together, and our brain actually sees the whole instead of the individual people. Another example would be proximity. So proximity just means that things near each other seem to be grouped together in our brains. The only reason, if you're looking at the picture below, that we perceive two different blocks of dots is because of their position and how close they are to each other. Most of you would say you see a block of 3 columns and a block of 2 columns. But if those dots were miles and miles apart, you wouldn't perceive them as being two different groups, right? But if they were right next to each other, you would perceive them as being just one group. So our brain, based on physical proximity, will split things into different groups. Okay. Continuity then is another Gestalt principle. So continuity is when points that are connected by straight or curving lines are seen in a way that follows the smoothest path. Music is individual notes that are strung together, and our brains bring those notes together into one smooth unit through the principle of continuity. We hear it all together almost as like a musical pathway when you're listening to a song. You're not just perceiving those individual notes. Okay, a couple more principles here. So closure refers to the idea that when things are grouped together, they seem to be complete in some entity. And when they're not, we fill in the gaps to create a whole complete object for ourselves. Closure can be seen in the picture below. So while these roughly drawn shapes aren't finished, we can perceive that these shapes are a circle and a rectangle. And our ability to see closure with almost finished objects like that kind of fills in the missing information for us. We also can see a triangle there, kind of in the middle of the view. And then finally, figure ground. We talked about this on the first day of school, actually, and I showed you some optical illusions related to figure ground. But the idea here is that our brain organizes our visual field into objects that stand out from their surroundings, and then the background. And so here you can see either two faces sticking out to you as the figure, and the white is the ground, the background, or you see the white sticking out to you as the figure and the blue as the background. But the idea behind figure ground is that in any visual situation, something is going to stand out to you as the figure against the background. Okay, we talked a little bit about depth perception, and I'm going to wait until our class time together next time to explain the visual cliff experiment for you. But go ahead and for now, just get the definition of depth perception into your notebook, and we'll talk about this more in class. So nothing needed here for the example. If you wanted to just write visual cliff, you could do that. Moving forward, so we talked about how important depth perception is. If we saw the world in 2D, that would be a problem for us, right? So we would fall off curbs, we would have a lot of problems. And so retinal disparity and convergence are two terms that help us understand why we're able to see depth, how we're able to see depth based on having two eyeballs, all right? So retinal disparity is the idea that each of our two eyeballs provides our brain with slightly different views, slightly different input. Binocular cues exist because we have two eyes in the front of our head. Okay, convergence means that we're using both eyes to focus on the same object. And as an object moves close, our eyes come closer together to focus. As our eyes look at an object farther away, they move farther apart to focus. And so we'll do some demonstrations with retinal disparity and convergence in class next time. We also have monocular cues to depth perception. So binocular cues to depth perception refer to having two working eyes that work together to help us see the world. Sometimes that's not the case. And sometimes maybe only one eye works in an individual. And so these monocular cues to depth perception, meaning you only need one working eye to detect these. It's fine if you have two working eyes, but you only need one to detect these cues. That refers to monocular cues. They're available to either eye alone. And a lot of times you see these monocular cues to depth perception in different artworks. So if anyone is interested in drawing or painting in particular, artists regularly use these monocular cues to create the perception of depth in a two-dimensional drawing. So for each of the monocular cues that you see here, we're going to go ahead and get the definition and see some examples in art, and you can put those into your interactive notebook for this portion. Okay, the first is linear perspective. And so it looks like the flowers in this picture seem farther away in the distance because the rows actually converge, and our brain reads this as a sign of distance. It's wider in the front and it goes to the back, and it converges a little bit. So this is a real life image, but you can recreate this in a two-dimensional drawing by creating something that's wider in the front that then gets more narrow in the back. That's linear perspective when we look at a monocular cue. Another would be interposition. So interposition is when one object appears to block our view of another one. Then we assume that the object blocking our view of the other one is actually closer to us. It's in between us and the blocked object. So in the horse and tree example, the tree seems to be blocking our view of the rear end of that horse. And so that's interposition. The tree's interposition is blocking our ability to see the whole picture of that horse. And so we think that the tree then is in front of the horse, when again, really that's just a two-dimensional drawing. Relative size is fascinating. So we intuitively know as human beings to interpret familiar objects of known size as farther away from us when they appear to our brain to be smaller, right? And so in the image with the flowers there, those flowers in the very back, they seem to be farther away because they look smaller to us. If we brought them up close, we would see that they're the same size. In the comic book, that guy says, I have no depth perception. Is there a cop standing on the corner, or do you have a tiny person in your hair? And so the idea is that, again, based on our top-down processing, we perceive things differently based on our own life experiences and things like that. But relative size gives us an indication of how close or far away something is to us. Relative height. So we tend to perceive the higher part of a scene as farther away from us. This scene can look like layers of buildings with the highest part of the picture as the sky. And if we flip the picture, then the black part can seem like night sky because it's now the highest part in the picture. Relative motion. So when we're moving, we can tell which objects are farther away because it takes us longer to pass them. A picture of a moon on a sign would zip behind us, but the actual moon is too far for us to pass. And then the phi phenomenon, the phi phenomenon, either way, this is an illusion of movement created when two or more adjacent lights blink off and on in quick succession. So nothing is actually moving in these images. It's different flashes of lights that are kind of adjacent to each other. Lastly, we look at shading in terms of trying to create light and shadow in terms of depth perception. So shading helps our perception of depth. Look at the middle circle. Does it seem to bolt out or curve inward? And your answer to that is going to depend on the shading, the light and the shadow that's indicated there. And then texture gradient. When you're looking at an object that extends into the distance, like a grassy field, the texture becomes less and less apparent the farther it goes into the distance. It's very detailed up front, right in front of your eyeballs, but the farther it goes, the more smooth it looks because the farther away something is, our eyes can't perceive it at that level of detail. So these are all different ways that you can create depth perception in a two-dimensional image, and it's just all different ways that our brains perceive depth in real life. And then relative clarity, really similar to that texture gradient. So objects that appear sharp, clear, and detailed are obviously seen as closer than more hazy objects, which would be seen as farther away. Just a little bit more here. So we're going to look at perceptual constancy. The idea is that stimuli around us are constantly moving, changing shape, and all those things, but we need to be able to perceive objects as unchanging to do our lives well. And so our brains make adjustments and interpretations without our conscious awareness so that we do perceive objects as the same. Otherwise, our view of the world would not make any sense. For instance, let's talk about color constancy. And again, you can put these definitions and examples in your notebook. The ability to see a consistent color in changing illumination helps us see that the three sides of this image are actually all yellow. But our brain shouldn't perceive it that way because there's different wavelengths of light affecting this, but it would make no sense to our brain if it wasn't all yellow. And so our brain just makes that adaptation for us and says, look at the yellow cube with the blue circles in the middle. But it doesn't all look yellow, but our brain tells us that's a yellow cube with blue in the middle. On this screen, squares A and B are actually exactly the same shade of gray, and you can see that when you actually connect them together. But if you first look at the image, the B looks white, doesn't it? And so it's so interesting again, because our brains do not exist in the world. They exist inside our body, and they're relying on whatever our eyeballs are telling it about wavelengths of light and other things like that to make sense of the world. And so especially when we think about color constancy, it's so crazy to me how subjective reality can be and how one person can view something as a completely different color than another person based on what's happening around them and the types of information that are hitting their eyeballs at any given time. A phenomenal example of this, you guys, is this dress. You should Google this dress just for fun. It was this whole phenomenon that blew up the internet a number of years ago. You're probably too young to remember it. But the big question on the internet was, what color is this dress? Is it white and gold or is it blue and black? In this picture, it clearly looks white and gold, but underneath other lighting, this exact same dress looks blue and black. And so people were arguing back and forth with each other, and it was this whole situation. So why does this happen? So remember, bottom up processing is what your sensory receptors actually see, hear, smell, feel, etc. So in the instance of the dress, what your receptors are seeing. Top-down processing is what your brain interprets from the data that it receives, and then transduction is converting those physical stimuli into neural impulses that the brain can interpret. And so it's so easy for any part of that to break down a little bit, and then one person is seeing something totally different than another person. So our brain processes the image as being overexposed or underexposed based on the sensory input that it's received. Originally, you see from the rods and cones in your eyeballs, but there's so much more really happening here. And so we're going to talk about this next time in class when we look about more specifically at how vision works. Okay, last couple things. In addition to color constancy, we also have size constancy and shape constancy. Size constancy means we have an ability to use distance-related context cues to help us see objects as the same size, even if the image on our retina becomes smaller. So basically, this is saying that with my giant 6'9" husband, when he stands right next to me, he absolutely looks 6'9". When he walks far, far away from me, technically, my brain should perceive him as shrinking or getting smaller, but it doesn't because of size constancy. My brain's like, nope, he's still 6'9". He's just far, far away from you, and that's why he looks this big instead of 6'9". And then lastly, we have shape constancy, and this is our ability to perceive objects as having a constant shape, even though if the object is rotated differently on our eyeballs, we should perceive it as a totally different shape. So for instance, this door, our brain perceives as a rectangle, regardless of what position the door is in. This is all helpful for us to make sense of the world around us. Okay, last little bit of information for today is the idea of perceptual sets. And so we've talked about top-down processing. And when we talk about top-down processing being prone to error or just differences in human opinion, a perceptual set is what we expect to see when we're perceiving information, and that influences what we do, in fact, see. Perceptual set is an example of top-down processing. So if you believe in aliens, you guys, you might look at these two images and see the black images to the left and the lighter images to the right as like flying saucers or spaceships or something like that. But if you do not believe that aliens exist, then you might see the things to the right as just being clouds, or to the left as just being dark spots in the sky. So the idea is that two human beings can look at the exact same stimulus and see different things based on their pre-existing ideas and information and experiences. It's what makes the world just a real fascinating place to be. Okay, context effects. This refers to the idea that cultural context helps form our perceptions, and our perceptions are also influenced by our motivations and emotions. Depending on what's happened to you in the past, you might view this picture as a horrifying scene of some giant guy chasing a smaller guy. Or you might be like, that looks like a fun game of tag. I'm going to hop in. There's also some interesting examples related to culture indicated for you in your notebook related to this as well. Here's just a quick example for you of the context effect on perception. So if you look at these two pictures, the center dot tends to look bigger in the image on the right because of the context that's happening around that particular dot. Okay, and then lastly, we know from so many different psychological experiments that our emotions, our physical state, and our motivation all influence what we actually perceive. So, interestingly, experiments have shown that destinations seem a lot farther away when you're tired. A target looks farther when your crossbow is heavier. A hill looks steeper when you have a heavy backpack on, or after sad music, or when walking alone. They've done all of this through self-report survey studies and things like that. Um, and something that you desire tends to look closer to you. Last little thing here is the impact of attention on perception. So we've already talked about selective attention, that it's drawing our awareness to relevant stimuli while ignoring other stimuli in the environment. We also said there's a limit on how much information can be selectively attended to and processed at any given time. Okay. Um, a big idea in this part of the chapter is that it's really not possible to multitask when you're trying to pay selective attention to two different things at once. And in a minute, you're going to see an experiment that shows that that is true. It is possible to multitask if one of the things that you're doing is not consciously processed, right? So if you can walk and chew gum, you can think and chew gum, you can read and chew gum, you can't simultaneously read two difficult texts at the same time. That's the idea behind divided attention or trying to multitask. Okay. The Stroop effect is an example of having to really selectively attend to get something right. So if you look at this square, some of you did this on our little brain exploration day. This was one of the games you could play on that website. But our brains tend to recognize the color of a word first, and that interferes with our ability to actually read the word aloud. You have to really selectively attend to notice that that first word there says purple. Your brain automatically sees red. Um, we'll talk about the cocktail party effect next time, but the cocktail party effect basically is you can be really selectively attending to almost anything in the world, but if you hear your own name from across the room or somewhere else, it almost always causes you to break selective attention and attend to your own name because your brain has learned that it's really important that you should pay attention when somebody calls your name. Okay, for your last little bit of time today, go ahead and watch this video on inattentional blindness. This is failing to see visible objects when our attention is directed elsewhere. This is fascinating. And then watch the short video related to change blindness. So this is a type of inattentional blindness. It's our inability to see changes in the environment when our attention is directed elsewhere. So you can wrap up your online learning time by looking at those two videos and finishing up your notebook. And I look forward to unpacking all of this good stuff with you in class next time.